The floorboards groaned under the deputy's weight, a sound like an old man's last breath. Outside, the Missouri Ozark wind howled through the skeletal fingers of winter-bare trees. It was 1928, 14 years after the last living soul was seen at the Caldwell place. The cabin stood as a rotten tooth in the jawbone of the hills, a place the locals had long since condemned with their silence. Deputy Miller wasn't a local. He was from Springfield, sent to inventory the abandoned property before the bank seized it for good. He moved through the single dusty room, a shaft of weak sunlight cutting through the grime on the window, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. The air was thick with the scent of decay, not of flesh, but of time itself, of forgotten stories and secrets left to fester. On a small, crudely made table in the corner, a leather-bound journal lay open. It was the only thing in the room that seemed to defy the blanket of dust. Miller approached it cautiously, his boots leaving clean prints on the filthy floor. The book was open to the last page, the ink faded but the handwriting clear, almost frantic. The final entry was dated October 31st, 1914. It contained no grand confession, no detailed explanation. Just 7 words, scratched into the paper with such force that they had torn through to the page beneath. 7 words that would become the first echo of a macabre history too dark to tell. 7 words that would haunt Deputy Miller for the rest of his days. It read, "He is not our father, he wears his face." To understand the horrifying final act that took place in that isolated cabin, we must first rewind the clock. We must go back to the spring of 1914, when the Ozark Hills were alive with the promise of new life, a promise that would never be fulfilled for the Caldwell family. The Ozarks of this era were a world unto themselves, a rugged, insular landscape of deep hollows, twisting creeks, and ancient forests that swallowed sound and light. The people here were forged from the same unforgiving stone as the mountains they called home. They were wary of outsiders and held tight to traditions and superstitions that stretched back for generations, whispers of creatures that stalked the moonless nights and curses that clung to bloodlines like a shroud. In one of the most secluded hollows, miles from the nearest neighbor, lived Josiah Caldwell and his 2 daughters, 18-year-old Alara and 16-year-old Maeve. Josiah was a man carved from hardship, a fire and brimstone preacher without a congregation, whose only gospel was fear and whose only disciples were his children. He had brought his family to this remote plot of land a decade earlier, seeking to escape the perceived sin and corruption of the modern world. But sin, they would discover, was not so easily outrun. It had followed them, or perhaps it had been waiting for them all along, dormant in the soil, patient as the ancient stones that littered the unforgiving landscape around their home. The family was already a ghost story in the making, long before they vanished. The shadow that loomed largest over the Caldwell family was the absence of its matriarch, Martha Caldwell. Officially, her death 2 years prior in 1912 had been ruled a tragic accident. The town marshal had recorded that she had slipped and fallen into a deep, rock-lined ravine at the edge of their property while gathering herbs. Josiah had told the story with a stoic, almost unnerving calm. He claimed he had found her at dusk, her body broken at the bottom of the shadowy chasm. He'd carried her back to the cabin himself, a final, grim act of marital duty. But the whispers in the nearby town of Eminence told a different, more disturbing tale. Martha had been a gentle woman, known for her knowledge of herbal remedies and her quiet defiance of her husband's iron will. Some said she wasn't gathering herbs at all that day. They said she was running. They spoke of bruises that often colored her arms, of a spirit that was being systematically crushed. The women of the town, in hushed tones over sewing circles and laundry lines, wondered how a woman who knew those woods like the back of her hand could simply slip. They wondered about the fury that sometimes flashed in Josiah's eyes, a fury that seemed to burn hottest when directed at his wife. Her death created a vacuum in the small cabin, a void that was quickly filled by Josiah's escalating tyranny and a creeping, unspoken dread. For her daughters, Alara and Maeve, their mother's grave became a silent testament not to a tragic accident, but to a forbidden truth they were too terrified to speak aloud, a truth that would ultimately seal their own macabre fate. Ilara and Maeve Caldwell were as different as the sun and the moon, two halves of a fractured whole. Ilara, the elder, was her mother's daughter, quiet, watchful, and introspective. She moved with a gentle grace that seemed out of place in the harsh environment of their day. Eiley lives. She found solace in the woods, not in her father's brutal scripture. She kept a detailed journal, a secret world of pressed flowers, sketches of woodland creatures, and observations of the natural world. It was her only escape, a place where her father's suffocating presence could not reach. Her entries were filled with a poetic melancholy, a deep yearning for a world beyond the grim confines of their hollow. Maeve, on the other hand, was a spark of defiance in a world of oppressive gray. She was her father's daughter in spirit, if not in faith. She possessed a fiery temper and a rebellious streak that Josiah constantly sought to beat into submission. Where Ilara retreated inward, Maeve pushed back. She questioned their isolation, challenged her father's draconian rules, and dreamed openly of escaping to St. Louis, a city she knew only from a tattered postcard she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. This fundamental difference in their natures created a powerful, protective bond between them. Ilara's quiet strength soothed Maeve's volatile spirit, while Maeve's fierce defiance gave Ilara the courage she often lacked. They were each other's only ally in a silent war against their father, a war that was about to escalate into something far more terrifying and strange. The summer of 1914 began with an oppressive heat that seemed to bake the very life out of the Ozark Hills. The creeks ran low, and a strange, tense silence settled over the woods. It was during this time that the girls began to notice a change in their father. Josiah's already severe demeanor curdled into something darker, more paranoid. He spent less time tending their meager crops and more time pacing the perimeter of their property, his shotgun cradled in his arms. He spoke of a sickness in the woods, a corruption that was trying to seep into their home. At night, he would nail the windows shut, even in the stifling heat, and read aloud from the most brutal passages of the Old Testament, tales of divine retribution, of plagues and punishments visited upon the wicked. His sermons, once directed at the sins of the outside world, now seemed to focus on the two young women trapped in the cabin with him. He saw sin in Maeve's defiant glances, in Ilara's silent withdrawals. He began to interpret every misfortune, a failed crop, a sick goat, as a sign of a spiritual stain within his own family, a curse they had brought upon themselves. The girls learned to move about the cabin like mice, to speak in whispers, to make themselves as small as possible, but there was no hiding from his ever-watchful eyes. The suffocating atmosphere inside the cabin was becoming a crucible, and the pressure was building toward a horrifying breaking point. They were no longer just isolated, they were imprisoned, and they were beginning to suspect that the monster their father claimed to be protecting them from was, in fact, the man who locked the door behind them each night. It was Maeve who first saw the strange carvings. Deep in the woods, beyond the ravine where her mother had died, she found them etched into the bark of ancient oak trees. They were not the simple initials of lovers or the marks of hunters. These were complex geometric symbols, unlike anything she had ever seen. They were arranged in patterns, leading deeper and deeper into the forest's shadowed heart. When she showed them to Ilara, her older sister felt a tremor of primal fear. The symbols felt ancient, wrong. They resembled some of the darker folk signs the old women in town would whisper about, symbols meant to ward off evil, or, in some horrifying cases, to invite it in. The girls knew their father forbade them from venturing this far, but a morbid curiosity pulled them forward. Following the trail of macabre symbols, they found a small, hidden clearing. In the center was a flat, moss-covered stone, like an altar. And on the stone was the disturbing, desiccated corpse of a fox, its body arranged in a deliberate, unnatural spiral. Its mouth was propped open with a sharpened twig pointing towards their cabin. A cold dread washed over the sisters. This was not the work of a predator. This was a ritual. It was a message. But who was sending it, and what did it mean? As they backed away, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a tangible pressure on their skin. They fled back to their home, but the sense of safety was gone. They now knew that their father's paranoia was not entirely unfounded. There was something else in these woods, something ancient, patient, and malevolent. The discovery in the woods planted a seed of terror that began to sprout in the dark soil of the Caldwell home. The sisters decided, in a pact of fearful silence, not to tell their father about the carvings or the ritualistically placed fox. They feared his reaction. Would he see it as a sign of their own corruption for venturing into the forbidden woods? Or worse, would his paranoia explode into a new, more dangerous form of madness? They couldn't risk it. So they held the secret between them, a shared burden that only deepened their isolation. But the secret festered. Alara began to document the symbols in her journal, trying to decipher their meaning, her beautiful sketches of flowers replaced by disturbing, angular patterns. Maeve, in contrast, grew more aggressive, her fear manifesting as anger. She started carrying a small whittling knife with her at all times, a meager defense against a threat she couldn't name. Strange things began to happen around the property. They would hear noises at night, not the familiar sounds of woodland creatures, but a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from just beyond the tree line. On several occasions, they woke to find a single black feather placed on their windowsill, a macabre calling card left while they slept. Their father, consumed by his own righteous fury, seemed oblivious to these subtle, creeping intrusions. Or more chillingly, perhaps he wasn't. Perhaps he knew exactly what was happening, and his nightly sermons and nailed-shut windows were not to keep a vague evil out, but to keep a very specific one in. The girls were trapped between two looming horrors, the strange, unknown presence in the woods and the increasingly tyrannical man inside their home. They had no one to turn to, no one to trust. The thin veil, separating their fragile reality from a world of macabre folklore, was beginning to tear. As the summer waned, giving way to the melancholic decay of autumn, the entity in the woods grew bolder. It was no longer just sounds or symbols. Now there were sightings, fleeting glimpses of a figure at the edge of the woods as dusk fell, a tall, unnaturally thin silhouette that seemed to melt back into the shadows the moment it was seen. The locals had a name for such a thing: the Shadow Man, a creature of Ozark folklore, a harbinger of doom that was said to cling to families tainted by tragedy or sin. The Caldwells, with their history of death and their suffocating piety, were fertile ground for such a legend to take root. Alara saw it first, a flicker of impossible darkness moving between the trees as she drew water from the well. It was gone in a heartbeat, but the image was burned into her mind. A few nights later, Maeve was woken by a scratching sound at the window. When she peered through a crack in the shutter, she saw it standing by the woodpile, a man-shaped void, a patch of night darker than the surrounding darkness. She didn't scream. The fear was too cold, too deep for that. She simply watched until it turned its featureless head toward the cabin and then dissolved into the gloom. They tried to convince themselves it was a trick of the light, their own frayed nerves playing tricks on them. But the sightings continued, becoming more frequent, more audacious. The presence was closing in. Was this the sickness their father had been raving about? Or was it something they had summoned themselves, by straying too close to the dark places of the woods and uncovering things man was meant to leave alone? The story of the Caldwell sisters was no longer just about a troubled family. It was descending into a full-blown, horrifying folk tale, and the line between man and monster was becoming terrifyingly blurred. The girls' terror was compounded by the fact that they had nowhere to turn. Their father's self-imposed isolation had become a cage. Their nearest neighbors were the Millers, a family over 3 miles away, and Josiah had long ago forbidden any contact with them, labeling them as godless gossips. Their only connection to the outside world was the monthly trip Josiah took to Eminence for supplies. He never took the girls with him. These trips, once a source of dread as they were left alone, now represented their only glimmer of hope. In early October, with the trees ablaze in funeral colors, Maeve decided she couldn't take it anymore. She penned a desperate, frantic note to the town marshal, a man named Abernathy whom she had seen only a handful of times. In the note, She spoke of her father's cruelty, of their fear for their lives, and of the strange, threatening presence that haunted their woods. She didn't mention the shadow man by name for fear of sounding insane, but she described a trespasser who watched them from the trees. Her plan was simple. When their father went to town, she and Alara would cut through the woods to the Miller farm and beg them to take the note to the marshal. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. If Josiah found out, his punishment would be biblical. But the fear of what would happen if they did nothing was now far greater. The note was their prayer, a plea cast into a world that had all but forgotten them. This small act of rebellion, this fragile scrap of paper, would set in motion the final, macabre sequence of events. The official records of this cold case are sealed, but the whispers remain. If you believe Soame, stories should never be forgotten. Subscribe to our channel, because the tale of the Caldwell sisters is one that history tried to erase. The day of Josiah's trip to town arrived, shrouded in a cold, persistent autumn rain. The sky was the color of slate, and the air smelled of wet earth and dying leaves. As their father hitched the mule to the cart, he gave the girls their instructions with a chilling finality. "The devil finds work for idle hands," he warned, his eyes lingering on Maeve. "Stay inside, bar the door, do not open it for anyone but me." His gaze was so intense it felt like a physical weight. As his cart rumbled down the muddy track and disappeared into the mist-shrouded trees, a profound silence descended upon the cabin. For the first time in months, the girls could breathe. But there was no time for relief. With Maeve's hidden note clutched in her hand, they slipped out the back door and ran. The forest was a dripping, disorienting labyrinth. The familiar paths were slick with mud, and the rain plastered their thin dresses to their skin. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps behind them. The feeling of being watched was more intense than ever before, as if the woods themselves were a conscious entity, observing their desperate flight. They ran with a primal fear driving them, the image of the shadow man lurking in their minds, intertwined with the more immediate terror of their father's potential return. After what felt like an eternity, they saw the faint, welcoming plume of smoke from the miller's chimney. Sobbing with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, they stumbled into the clearing, their hopes pinned on the kindness of near strangers. But the kindness they sought would be a catalyst for a horror they could not yet imagine. Their desperate plea for help was about to be answered by a terrifying silence. Martha Miller was a kind, weather-beaten woman who, despite Josiah Caldwell's reputation, took pity on the two half-drowned girls who appeared on her porch. She brought them inside, wrapped them in warm blankets, and listened with growing alarm as Maeve, trembling, recounted their story. Alara stood by the window, a silent, haunted sentinel, her eyes scanning the tree line. Mrs. Miller read the note and her face grew pale. She had heard the whispers about Josiah, had seen the fear in his daughter's eyes on the rare occasions they crossed paths years ago. She promised she would give the note to her husband, John, to take to Marshal Abernathy first thing in the morning. She urged the girls to stay, offering them shelter for the night, but they refused. The fear of their father returning to an empty cabin was too great. They believed their only chance was to be back before he returned, for him to be unaware of their transgression. Reluctantly, Mrs. Miller let them go, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. As she watched them disappear back into the dripping maw of the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling she had just sent 2 lambs back to the wolf. John Miller did take the note to Eminence the next day. He handed it directly to Marshal Abernathy, a man known more for his lethargy than his diligence. The marshal read the note, his brow furrowed. He grumbled about the Caldwells and their history of strangeness, dismissing Maeve's claims as the dramatic fantasies of a teenage girl desperate for attention. He folded the note, tucked it into his desk drawer, and promised he'd look into it when he had the time. That drawer would become the note's tomb. The plea for help was filed away, buried under bureaucratic indifference. No one was coming to save the Caldwell sisters. They were on their own, and their one desperate act of hope had been swallowed by the very world they were trying to reach. The return journey to the cabin was even more terrifying than the flight to the Millers. The brief taste of warmth and safety had made the cold reality of their home seem all the more grim. As they crept back onto their property, they could see the cabin sitting in the gloom, dark and silent. Their father was not yet back. With a surge of relief, they slipped inside, changed out of their wet clothes and tried to erase any sign of their absence. But something was wrong. The air in the cabin was different, colder, heavier. A faint, musky odor like damp soil and something metallic lingered near the hearth. Then Alara saw it. On the rough-hewn mantel above the fireplace where their mother's tarnished silver locket used to sit, there was now a single, perfectly formed bird's nest. Inside the nest, resting on a bed of woven twigs and mud, were three small, smooth stones, stained a dark, rusty red. They looked disturbingly like dried blood. It was a chilling, deliberate message. Someone or something had been inside the cabin while they were gone. The locked door had not stopped it. The sanctity of their home had been violated. The evil they feared was no longer due. Since outside in the woods it had crossed the threshold. It had been in their home, touching their things, leaving its macabre mark. Panic seized them. They checked the windows, the door, all were still secured from the inside just as they had left them. There was no rational explanation. It was an impossible, horrifying intrusion, a clear sign that the rules of their world no longer applied. The entity was not just watching them anymore. It was playing with them. When Josiah returned that evening, he was in a foul mood. The trip to town had clearly soured him. He said little, moving about the cabin with a thunderous silence that was more terrifying than his rages. The girls watched his every move, their hearts hammering in their chests. Did he know? Could he sense their betrayal? He seemed to pay no mind to the strange nest on the mantel, either not noticing it or, more chillingly, not finding its presence unusual. That night the atmosphere in the cabin was electric with unspoken terror. As the girls lay in their shared bed, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind sounded like a prelude to horror. It was close to midnight when the sound started. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from the door or a window. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, deliberate, patient rhythm. The sound was directly under their bed. The girls lay paralyzed, clutching each other in the darkness, their breath held tight in their chests. The tapping continued for what felt like hours, a relentless, nerve-shredding beat. It was the sound of something wanting in, or perhaps something wanting to remind them it was already there. They dared not make a sound, convinced that the slightest movement would bring whatever was beneath them bursting through the floor. The source of the tapping remains one of the most disturbing and unexplained elements of this macabre case. Was it a prelude to the final horror, a psychological torment inflicted by a human monster? Or was it something else entirely, a paranormal phenomenon that defies all logical explanation? What is certain is that, for Alara and Maeve, it was the night the last of their hope died, replaced by the certainty that they were trapped in a grave of their own father's making. The days that followed the night of the tapping were a descent into a living nightmare. The barrier between reality and delusion, between the psychological and the supernatural, seemed to dissolve completely. Josiah's behavior grew increasingly bizarre. He stopped eating with the girls, taking his meager meals to stand by the window and stare out into the darkening woods. He began talking to himself in low, guttural whispers, having heated arguments with an unseen presence. Alara, documenting these changes in her journal, wrote that his eyes had taken on a vacant, glassy look, as if the man they knew was no longer looking out from behind them. He would sometimes stop mid-sentence and tilt his head, as if listening to a voice only he could hear. The entity in the woods, the shadow man, was no longer seen. It was as if it had found what it was looking for, as if it no longer needed to wait outside. The horrifying thought began to form in the girls' minds, a thought so monstrous it was almost unspeakable. What if the entity they feared had not just entered their home? What if it had entered their father? Was this the meaning of the strange, bloody nest on the mantel, a symbol of a new, unholy family? The idea was insane, the product of terrified, isolated minds. But it was the only explanation that fit the escalating madness. Their father, the cruel, tyrannical preacher, was gone. In his place stood something that looked like him, that sounded like him, but was utterly, terrifyingly other. This is the point in the story where the narrative fractures, where the line between a crime story and a tale of possession becomes irrevocably blurred. And it is this ambiguity that makes the final act so profoundly disturbing. The last week of October 1914 was marked by a series of horrifying ritualistic acts. Josiah, or the thing that wore his face, began bringing dead animals into the cabin, not for food but for some other darker purpose. He would lay the creatures on the hearthstone, a crow, a rabbit, a large black snake, and arrange their bodies into the same strange, geometric symbols the girls had seen carved into the trees. He would sit and stare at these macabre arrangements for hours, humming a tuneless, discordant melody. The stench of death filled the small cabin, a constant, sickening reminder of the madness that had consumed their lives. The girls were no longer his daughters. They were his prisoners, his audience. He barely spoke to them, but they could feel its gaze on them constantly, a cold, analytical appraisal. Ilara's journal entries from this time become fragmented, almost incoherent, filled with desperate prayers and sketches of the dead. Animals, as if she were trying to create a record of the insanity, a testament for a world she was certain she would never see again. She wrote of the humming, describing it as the sound of the earth turning over in its grave. She described her father's hands as he arranged the bodies, noting that his movements were too fluid, too graceful for the calloused, clumsy man he had once been. The most terrifying part was the silence. The rages were gone. The beatings had stopped. All that was left was this calm, methodical, and utterly inhuman behavior. They were in the presence of something ancient and patient, something that was slowly, deliberately, setting the stage for its final, macabre performance. And they knew, with a certainty that chilled them to their bones, that they were to be the main attraction. October 31st, Halloween, a day when the veil between worlds is said to be at its thinnest. For the Caldwell sisters, it would be the day the veil was torn away completely. A storm rolled in at dusk, a violent, unseasonable tempest that lashed the cabin with wind and rain. Inside, the only light came from the flickering fireplace, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. Josiah had been silent all day, sitting in his chair, watching the storm gather. He had placed a new object on the hearthstone altar, an old, hand-carved wooden doll that had belonged to Maeve as a small child. Its button eyes stared blankly into the room. As the storm reached its peak, he finally stood up. He did not look at his daughters. He walked to the cabin door, unbarred it, and threw it open, letting the wind and rain howl into the room, extinguishing all the lamps and leaving only the firelight. He stood there silhouetted against the raging storm, a dark figure at the threshold of reality. Then he spoke, his voice unnervingly calm amidst the chaos. "It is time," he said, not to the girls but to the roaring darkness outside. "The house is clean, the vessels are prepared." Ilara and Maeve huddled together in the corner, their terror reaching a fever pitch. This was it, the moment they had been dreading. The performance was about to begin. The entity in their father had invited its master in, and the storm was its herald. What happened next is not recorded in any official document. It exists only in the realm of speculation, in the dark folklore of the Ozarks, and in the chilling implications of the final, seven-word entry in Ilara's journal. This is the heart of the darkness, the part of the story that remains shrouded in mystery and speculation. What truly happened on that stormy Halloween night inside the Caldwell cabin? We have only fragments, echoes of the horror. We have the scene Deputy Miller would discover 14 years later, the abandoned cabin, the layer of dust, the journal left open on the table. And we have that final, cryptic entry. "He is not our father. He wears his face." This single sentence, written in Ilara's hand, is the last known communication from the Caldwell sisters. It is a terrifying testament to their final realization. It suggests a complete and horrifying transformation, a loss of identity so profound that Josiah Caldwell was no longer recognizable as human to his own children. It speaks to a concept far older and more terrifying than simple madness or murder, the idea of the doppelganger, the fetch, the skinwalker. An entity that hollows out a person and takes their place. After Josiah opened the door to the storm, the story ends. The next morning, a hunter passing through the hollow noted that the Caldwell cabin was silent and dark, the chimney cold. He thought it odd but didn't investigate. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The seasons turned and the woods began the slow, patient work of reclaiming the small plot of land. The Caldwell family had simply vanished. No one came looking for them. In the isolated world of the Ozarks, it wasn't unheard of for a family to pack up and leave in the middle of the night. But the Caldwells left everything behind: their tools, their meager furniture, their livestock, which was eventually found starved in its pen. They had vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only a chilling whisper of an impossible, horrifying story. Let's return to 1928, to Deputy Miller standing in the derelict cabin, the journal in his hand. The 7 words on the page sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy, but the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin was undeniable. He began a more thorough search of the property. Behind the cabin, he found the small, overgrown family cemetery. There were 2 rough-hewn wooden crosses, one for the mother, Martha, and a smaller, unnamed one, likely for an infant lost long ago. There was no sign of graves for Josiah, Elara, or Maeve. In the ravine where Martha had supposedly fallen, he found nothing but rocks and dead leaves. The most disturbing discovery, however, came from under the cabin itself. Prying open a loose section of the foundation, Miller shone his flashlight into the dark, musty crawlspace. Directly beneath where the girl's bed would have been, the dirt was strangely disturbed. He dug down a few inches and his fingers brushed against something hard. It was a collection of small, polished animal bones, arranged in a perfect circle. In the center of the circle was a single, tarnished silver locket, the locket that was supposed to be on the mantel, the locket that had belonged to Martha Caldwell. Why was it buried there? And what was the significance of the bones? This discovery changed everything, pulling the investigation from a simple missing persons case into a horrifying new direction. We're about to cross a line into the truly forbidden. If you're compelled by the darkness that hides in the forgotten corners of history, make sure you're subscribed and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The discovery of the buried locket and the circle of bones deeply unsettled Deputy Miller. It was a clear sign that something more than a simple departure had taken place here. He packed Elara's journal and the locket as evidence and returned to Springfield, determined to open a formal investigation into the 14-year-old disappearance of the Caldwell family. He began by trying to trace Josiah Caldwell. He checked tax records, census data, and sent inquiries to neighboring states. The result was a dead end. It was as if Josiah and his daughters had walked out of their cabin on that Halloween night in 1914 and simply ceased to exist. There was no record of them anywhere. Next, he revisited the official report on Martha Caldwell's death from 1912. The account, written by the now-retired Marshal Abernathy, was cursory at best. It was based almost entirely on Josiah's word. There was no mention of an examination of the body, no interviews with anyone else. It was an open and shut case of an accidental fall. But Miller, now armed with the journal's hints of cruelty and the daughter's desperate, ignored plea for help, saw something far more sinister. He began to suspect that the entire macabre history of the Caldwells began not with a disappearance in 1914, but with a murder in 1912. The death of Martha was the inciting incident, the original sin that had allowed the darkness, whatever it was, to take root in the family and the land. He was no longer just searching for 3 missing people. He was hunting for a ghost, trying to unravel a cold case that had been buried for over a decade. Deputy Miller's investigation led him to seek out the old, retired Marshal Abernathy. He found him living in a small boarding house, a man withered by age and regret. When Miller presented him with Maeve's note from 1914, Abernathy's face crumpled. He remembered the note. He confessed that he had dismissed it, buried it, and had tried to forget about it for years, but it had haunted him. He admitted that he had always been intimidated by Josiah Caldwell, by his wild-eyed fanaticism and the latent violence that simmered just beneath his skin. It had been easier to do nothing. Abernathy, prodded by a guilty conscience, then revealed a piece of information he had kept to himself for 16 years. A few weeks after Martha Caldwell's death in 1912, a trapper had come to him, deeply disturbed. The trapper claimed that on the morning of Martha's death, he had been checking his lines near the Caldwell property. He hadn't seen Martha fall. He had heard her. He told Abernathy he'd heard a woman screaming, not in pain but in terror. And then he heard Josiah Caldwell's voice, not shouting for help but roaring in rage, quoting scripture about the purification of the unholy. The trapper was terrified of Josiah and had made Abernathy swear not to involve him. The marshal, wanting to avoid trouble, had agreed. He had buried this testimony along with Maeve's note. This revelation was the key. Martha Caldwell had not slipped. She had been driven. She had been hunted. Her death was a murder, and her husband was the killer. The foundation of the entire Caldwell story was a lie. The confirmation that Josiah had likely murdered his wife cast the subsequent events in a new, more horrifying light. The entity, the shadow man, the strange symbols, what role did they play? Were they supernatural forces drawn to an act of profound evil? Or did they have a more terrestrial, and perhaps more disturbing, explanation? Miller began to explore the local folklore more deeply. He spoke to the oldest residents of the Ozark Hollows, men and women who held the region's oral history. They told him stories that went back generations, about a secretive, pre-Christian folk tradition that had been practiced in the most isolated parts of the mountains. It was a dark, bloody practice, one that involved blood sacrifice, communication with ancient spirits of the land, and rituals designed to gain power or knowledge. They spoke of hollow men, individuals who would commit a terrible act, a foundational sin, to empty themselves out and invite a powerful, ancient entity to inhabit their bodies. They would become a vessel, a skin wearer, in exchange for protection or power over the natural world. The descriptions of these rituals, of the symbols used to mark territory, and of the behavior of a person who had been hollowed, matched Alara's journal entries with terrifying accuracy. The arranged animals, the humming, the strange new grace in Josiah's movements, it was all part of the lore. The pieces were beginning to fit together into a picture of almost unimaginable horror. Josiah hadn't just gone mad. He had performed a ritual. He had murdered his wife as a sacrifice to become something other than human. This new theory was monstrous, but it was the only one that explained everything. Josiah murders his wife, Martha, as part of a dark ritual to shed his humanity and become a vessel for some ancient power he believed in. This act of ultimate transgression hollows him out. For 2 years, he maintains a semblance of his former self, but his cruelty and paranoia increase as the transformation takes hold. His daughters, Alara and Maeve, become prisoners of the man who is no longer their father. The symbols in the woods, the dead fox, the feathers on the windowsill, these weren't warnings from an outside entity. They were ritual markers placed by Josiah himself. They were part of the process, the consecration of his territory. He was the shadow man they saw in the woods. He was the one tormenting them, testing their fear, preparing them. The rhythmic tapping from beneath the floorboards was not a ghost. It was him, in the crawlspace, placing their mother's locket inside a circle of bones, completing another step in a horrifying, months-long ceremony. The story was no longer about a family being haunted. It was about 2 girls being slowly, methodically prepared for a sacrifice by the monster that was wearing their father's face. The psychological horror of their situation is almost impossible to fathom. To be trapped with a man who is both intimately familiar and utterly alien, a predator who knows all their secrets and fears because he was once the man who raised them. Alara's final journal entry was not a descent into madness. It was a moment of absolute, horrifying clarity. What then was the purpose of the final ritual on Halloween night? If Josiah had already transformed, what more did he need? The folklore provided a chilling possible answer. The ritual of the Hollow Man was not just about personal transformation, it was about legacy. It was about passing the entity on, ensuring its survival. The final act often required new vessels, blood of the original host's blood. He hadn't been tormenting his daughters simply for cruelty's sake. He had been breaking them down, cleansing them, preparing the vessels, as he stated on that final night. He opened the door not for a storm, but for the culmination of his grand, macabre design. The storm was the perfect cover. The wind and thunder would have masked any screams. In the flickering firelight of the cabin, he would have completed the final act. The fate of Alara and Maeve becomes terrifyingly clear. They were not just victims of a murderer. They were the intended sacrifices in a horrifying generational curse. Their bodies were likely never found because they were never meant to be. According to the darkest legends, the bodies of the sacrificed were consumed, either literally or spiritually, by the ritual itself, their life force used to cement the bond between the entity and its new home. The cabin was not just a home, but a temple. The woods were not just a forest, but a consecrated ground. And the disappearance of the Caldwell sisters was not a mystery. It was the successful completion of a horrifyingly dark design. Armed with this monstrous theory, Deputy Miller faced a new problem. How could he possibly present this to his superiors? A report filled with tales of folk magic, skin wearers, and ritual sacrifice would get him laughed off the force, if not committed to an asylum. He had no bodies, no concrete evidence of a crime beyond a 16-year-old note and a dead woman's locket. The case was unwinnable in a court of law. The truth of what happened to the Caldwell sisters was too dark, too strange to ever be officially told. He realized with a sinking heart that the case was, and always would be, a cold case. The official story would remain that the family simply vanished. The macabre history would be erased, buried under the mundane explanation of a family that packed up and left. The horror would be forgotten by all but a few. Miller found himself haunted by the faces of Alara and Maeve, two young women whose desperate plea he had discovered over a decade too late. He had aired their story, but he was powerless to give them justice. The entity that had consumed their family had won. It had committed the perfect crime, one so outside the bounds of normal human experience that it was effectively invisible to the authorities. The curse, if it was real, had succeeded. The evil had been passed on, and somewhere out in the world, the thing that was once Josiah Caldwell could still be walking, wearing a new face, living a new life, its ancient hunger intact. Deputy Miller's investigation ended there, at least officially. He filed a final report stating that the whereabouts of the Caldwell family remained unknown, and the case was unsolvable due to the passage of time and lack of evidence. He sealed Alara's journal in an evidence locker, where it would gather dust for decades, its terrifying story hidden from the world. But the story did not end for Miller. The case became a private obsession, a wound that never healed. He held onto the old folklore books he had collected, and in his spare time, he would cross-reference unsolved disappearances in the Ozark region, looking for a pattern. Over the next 20 years of his career, he found 3 other cases that bore a disturbing resemblance to the Caldwells. A family that vanished from an isolated farmstead in the 1930s, leaving a half-eaten dinner on the table. A lone trapper who disappeared in the 1940s, his cabin found with strange symbols painted on the floor in animal blood. In each case, there was a history of violence, of isolation, and of rumors of the occult. Miller began to believe he was tracking the footprint of a single, nomadic evil as it moved through the decades, a predator that settled in a remote location, found a troubled soul to hollow out, and repeated its horrifying cycle. It was a terrifying, lonely crusade, a secret war fought in the margins of police reports and forgotten case files. He was hunting a ghost, a legend, and the trail was always cold. Caldwell Cabin itself has one final, macabre chapter. After the bank foreclosed on the property in 1928, it sat abandoned for another decade. The locals continued to avoid it, and children would dare each other to run up and touch the decaying porch. Stories of strange lights and whispered voices emanating from the empty building became a staple of local lore. In 1939, the property was finally sold to a timber company. The plan was to clear-cut the entire hollow. A crew of lumberjacks was sent in to demolish the old cabin before starting their work. The men who tore it down would later speak of the unnatural cold inside the structure, even on a warm summer day. They spoke of a feeling of being watched, of tools going missing, of a pervasive sense of dread that hung over the entire site. The most chilling part of their story, however, centered on the old stone fireplace. As they dismantled it stone by stone, they found something hidden in the chimney flue just above the mantel. It was a small bundle of cloth, tied with what looked like human hair. Inside the bundle were two objects: a crudely carved wooden doll with its button eyes gouged out and a dried, withered human tongue. The discovery brought the work to a halt. The men, deeply superstitious, refused to work on the property any longer. They packed their gear and left that very day, telling their foreman that the land was cursed. The timber company eventually abandoned the project, and the Caldwell Hollow was left to the woods once more, its darkest secret almost, but not quite, revealed. The discovery of the tongue and the desecrated doll adds another layer of horror to the Caldwell story. Whose tongue was it? The immediate, horrifying assumption is that it belonged to Martha Caldwell, taken by Josiah after her murder as a trophy or a key component of his ritual. A person's tongue, in many dark folk traditions, is believed to hold their words, their secrets, their very identity. By possessing it, one could silence them even beyond the grave or steal their power. The doll, which belonged to Maeve, with its eyes gouged out, is a clear symbol of violent, personal rage. It represents a symbolic blinding, a desire to prevent the victim from seeing the truth or bearing witness to the horror. Was this Josiah's final, symbolic act against his family before the transformation? One act to silence his murdered wife and another to blind his defiant daughter? Or was it part of the larger ritual, a necessary step in preparing the cabin, in cleaning the house, as he put it? We will never know for sure. But the objects, hidden in the very heart of the home, the hearth, suggest a deep, calculated, and ritualistic evil. They are the last physical remnants of the horror, a final, voiceless scream from the victims, discovered a quarter of a century too late. They serve as a grim confirmation that what happened in that cabin was far more than a simple case of a man going mad. It was a carefully orchestrated descent into a very old and very patient form of evil. What became of the thing that was once Josiah Caldwell? This is the most chilling and unanswerable question of the entire Macabre affair. If the theory of the Hollow Man is to be believed, then he or it simply walked away from the cabin on that Halloween night and blended back into the world. It would have looked like an ordinary man, perhaps a bit grim, a bit quiet, but a man nonetheless. It could have taken a new name, found a new town, even started a new family. The entity within would be patient, able to feign normalcy for years, even decades, before the hunger returned, before the need to repeat the cycle became overwhelming. It is a horrifying thought, a monster hidden in plain sight, an immortal predator wearing a succession of human faces as masks. Did Deputy Miller's collection of similar cold cases actually map its journey? Was the family in the 1930s, the trapper in the 1940s, its subsequent victims? The pattern is there, a faint, terrifying echo across the years. A string of disappearances from isolated locations, always marked by whispers of strange behavior, of paranoia, of dark, ritualistic elements left behind. It's a trail of breadcrumbs leading into an abyss of speculation. The entity that destroyed the Caldwell family didn't die. The curse didn't end. It just moved on, a cancer spreading through the lonely, forgotten corners of the country, leaving behind only silent, empty houses and stories that are too dark to tell. Ilara's journal is the Rosetta Stone of this entire case. Without it, the disappearance of the Caldwells would be a simple, unremarkable footnote in the history of a forgotten corner of the Ozarks. But her words, her observations, her descent from poetic melancholy into sheer terror, give a voice to the horror. She was not just a victim, she was the chronicler of her own family's damnation. Her final, seven-word entry is perhaps the most terrifying part of the entire narrative. It's a stark, simple statement of an impossible truth. It's the moment a child looks at her parent and sees a stranger, a monster. Imagine the psychological torment of that realization. To know that the man who raised you, the authority figure who controlled every aspect of your life, has been replaced by something utterly alien and malevolent. It's a uniquely intimate form of horror. The journal, locked away in an evidence room, is a banned history, a forbidden testimony. It tells a story that the rational world cannot accept, a story that blurs the lines between true crime and supernatural horror. It suggests that the monsters we should fear most are not the ones that come from without, but the ones that can hollow out and wear the faces of those we are supposed to love and trust. Ilara's last act was to bear witness, to write down the truth in the hopes that someone, someday, would find it and understand. She could not have known her words would be found by a deputy 14 years later, providing the only key to a mystery that was designed to be perfect, to be traceless. The story of the Caldwell sisters endures in the Ozarks, not as history, but as a cautionary tale, a ghost story told around campfires. The details have been twisted by time, but the core of the horror remains. They call the area Caldwell's Hollow, or more ominously, Hollow Man's Hollow. Locals claim that on a moonless Halloween night, you can still hear the faint sound of a young woman humming a sad, tuneless melody on the wind. Hunters and hikers who have ventured into the area speak of a sudden, unnatural cold, of the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, of finding strange, geometric patterns scratched into the dirt. Some have even reported fleeting glimpses of a tall, unnaturally thin figure moving at the edge of their vision, a shape of pure darkness that vanishes when looked at directly. The land itself is said to be tainted, imbued with the memory of the evil that took place there. The trees grow a little more twisted, the shadows are a little deeper, and the silence is a little heavier in Caldwell's Hollow. The story has become a part of the landscape, a permanent scar on the region's psyche. It serves as a reminder that some places are best left alone, that some stories are best left untold, and that the comforting veil of reality is much thinner in the deep, dark woods than we would like to believe. The curse of the Caldwells may be over for the family, but it now lives on in the land itself. The macabre history of the Caldwell sisters is a chilling mosaic of real-world horror and supernatural dread. It preys upon our deepest fears, the fear of isolation, the fear of familial betrayal, and the fear that we may not truly know the people closest to us. Was Josiah Caldwell simply a mentally ill man who, driven by religious fanaticism and guilt over murdering his wife, descended into a psychosis that led him to kill his children and disappear? This is the rational explanation. In this version, the shadow man, the tapping, the symbols, they are all figments of the girl's terrified imaginations, hallucinations brought on by extreme stress and abuse. Josiah, in his madness, creates his own folk religion, and his final act on Halloween is a murder-suicide, his own body and those of his daughters hidden so well in the vast wilderness of the Ozarks that they are never found. This interpretation is horrifying in its own right, a testament to the depths of human cruelty. But does it truly explain everything? Does it explain the impossible intrusion into the locked cabin, the testimony of the lumberjacks, the pattern of similar disappearances that followed for decades, or is the more terrifying explanation the truer one? That Josiah Caldwell did, in fact, make a bargain with something ancient and evil, and that he succeeded in his horrifying quest, sacrificing his family to become a monster that still walks among us. The story forces us to stand on the knife's edge between these two possibilities, and it is in that terrifying uncertainty that the true horror of the case resides. Ultimately, the file on the Caldwell family remains open, a permanent cold case. Deputy Miller passed away in the 1960s, taking his private obsession and his secret files with him to the grave. Ilara's journal remains in storage, its existence known only to a handful of clerks, its contents unread for generations. Marshall Abernathy's deathbed confession about the trapper's testimony was never officially recorded. The threads of the story are scattered, buried, and forgotten by official history. All that is left is the folklore, the whispers, the ghost story. The narrative has been reclaimed by the darkness from which it came. This is often the fate of stories that are too disturbing, too unbelievable. Society has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of horror, of turning uncomfortable truths into campfire tales. It's a coping mechanism. It is easier to believe in a haunted hollow than it is to believe in a father who would ritually sacrifice his entire family. It is easier to believe in a shadow man than it is to accept the possibility of a hollow man, a human-shaped predator living undetected among the flock. The truth of the Caldwell sisters is not just that they were victims of a horrifying crime, but that their story was banned, erased by a world that was not equipped and not willing to confront the nature of the evil that destroyed them. The land where the Caldwell cabin once stood is now part of the Ozark National Scenic Riverways. It is protected, pristine wilderness. Millions of people have likely hiked through the hollow over the years, completely unaware of the macabre history that saturates the soil beneath their feet. They might admire the ancient oaks, not knowing that their bark may still hold the faint scars of ritual carvings. They might pause for a rest by a deep ravine, not knowing it was the site of a brutal murder that started a chain of horrifying events. The silence of the woods is profound, but it is not empty. It is a silence filled with unspoken secrets. There is no monument to Martha, Elara, and Maeve Caldwell. Their names are not recorded on any plaque. Their story exists only in the ether, in the decaying pages of a forgotten journal, and in the dark corners of Ozark legend. They are ghosts in the truest sense of the word, not because their spirits haunt the hollow, but because their history has been almost completely erased from the world of the living. Their tragedy serves as a chilling reminder that the past is never truly dead. It lies dormant, waiting in the quiet places, in the abandoned homesteads and forgotten graves, ready to be discovered by those who are willing to look, and brave enough to listen to the horrifying stories it has to tell. What are we to make of such a tale in our modern, skeptical world? It's easy to dismiss the supernatural elements as the product of a bygone era, a time when superstition held sway over science. But to do so is to dismiss the terrified, first-hand account of Elara Caldwell herself. It is to ignore the disturbing patterns that Deputy Miller spent a lifetime tracking. And it is to turn a blind eye to the simple, terrifying fact that evil is real. Whether that evil takes the form of a supernatural entity or manifests in the profound darkness of the human heart is almost irrelevant. The result is the same. The destruction of the Caldwell family is a perfect storm of isolation, abuse, religious fanaticism, and perhaps something more. Something that slithered out of the ancient folklore of the hills and found a willing vessel in a broken man. The case is a stark warning that not all monsters have claws and fangs. Some have familiar faces. Some quote scripture, and the most dangerous ones are those who convince us they are protecting us from the very evil they are about to become. The story of the Caldwell sisters is a forbidden history, not just because of its macabre details, but because it holds up a dark mirror to the world, reflecting a truth we would rather not see. That the wilderness of the human soul can be a far more dangerous and terrifying place than any haunted forest. And so the hollow remains silent. The final horrifying truth of what happened on Halloween night in 1914 is locked away, its secrets kept by the ancient trees and the unquiet earth. We are left where Deputy Miller was left, with a handful of disturbing artifacts, a journal filled with an impossible story, and a lingering sense of profound dread. There is no resolution here. There is no justice for Elara and Maeve. There is only the cold, haunting echo of a story that history tried to forget. The thing that was Josiah Caldwell may have died of old age, or it may still be out there, wearing a new face, waiting for the right moment, the right family, the right isolated place to begin the cycle anew. The story has no end. That is the true, lasting horror. It leaves us with a question that lingers long after the tale is told, a question that might just follow you into the dark. How well do you truly know the people you love? And what secrets might be hiding behind their eyes, waiting for the right storm on the right night to open the door and invite the darkness in?